Institutional approval of humans and animals in research studies. The use of animals or humans as participants in a research study must be submitted for special institutional review and approval. A goal of the IRB is to protect human subjects from physical or psychological harm, which they attempt to do by reviewing research protocols and related materials. The Institutional Review Board, according to Christensen, Johnson, and Turner, is made up of scientists and non-scientists that exist at all institutions that receive federal funds for research. It reviews research proposals involving human participants. There are three categories of review a research approval can receive from the IRB: a full board, an expedited, or an exempt review. The full board category happens when all members of the IRB views and votes on the research project. Expedited category happens when it is reviewed by a subcommittee of the IRB and it proposes a minimal risk to participants and involves subjects that do not meet the exemption distinction. The exemption category exists when there is a very minimal risk to participants. The exemption distinction must be for topics that involve education and the research that is being collected is non-threatening. If the research study does not meet any of the first two categories, then it is subject to a full review. And the subjects that would be required to receive a full review are when the participants are children under the age of 18, the participants are prisoners, the participants are individuals with impaired decision-making capacity, they're economically or educationally disadvantaged, the procedures might cause physical harm, the procedures might cause significant psychological or emotional distress, the collection of information is about highly sensitive topics, the collection of information is about illegal behavior, or the collection of information could seriously harm the participant legally, socially, or financially. Institutional approval of research on animal subjects. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee either approves or denies the project. Research involving laboratory animals is funded by the United States National Institute of Health or other federal agencies. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee evaluates the number of animals to be used, the selection of the species, and the animal's possible exposure to discomfort or pain. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee has evolved over the years to regulate the welfare of animals in the USA that are being used for research. Benefits of pilot studies. A pilot study is an element of work of a larger project or program undertaken to gather data to reduce risk or uncertainty in the project or program. A pilot study can be undertaken to help in the selection of the appropriate risk mitigation strategy or in the application of the chosen method. It is designed to test the reliability of the data collection methods. If there is anything wrong with the research method at this time, then the researcher can make any necessary changes. Pilot studies are very helpful because they help to mitigate risk, they help the researcher to be better prepared, and also it helps save time and money because they've tested it out beforehand. The importance of gaining consent. Research involving human subjects can pose complex ethical issues which require careful thought and consideration on the part of both the researchers and the research participants. The consent process. Getting consent of an individual or their legally authorized representative without undue inducement or any element of force, fraud, duress, or any other form of restraint or coercion is extremely important to a research study, because without it, the study would not be approved or allowed to continue. The consent must be organized and presented in a way that facilitates comprehension. It should be written in a plain language that the research subjects can understand. The consent form should always be revised if there are changes in the study that might affect the participant or when additional information will improve the consent process. The consent form will protect the subject and won't waive or appear to waive any of their legal rights. And the signed waiver does not release the investigator, sponsor, or institution from liability of negligence. Each data collection method has its own strengths and weaknesses. When designing a research study, it is important to decide what type of data the study will produce so the researcher can select the best method of data collection that will produce the desired information. Different types of data collection methods involve reviewing historical documents, performing a literature review, content analysis, and examining secondary data. Observations involve observing the participant or participants in their natural environment. Surveys include having the subjects or subject fill out a questionnaire that is prepared and or be subject to an interview. Experimental data collection methods are true designs or quasi-designs, and a multi-methods approach involves nominal group technique or a combination of the different methods shown above. Sample size and sampling methods. How to choose a sample size. Sampling is a procedure where a fraction of the data is taken from a large set of data and the understandings are drawn from the sample. Sample size is extended to the whole group, so selecting the right sample size for a research project depends on many factors. Those factors are cost considerations, administrative concerns, minimal acceptable level of precision or confidence level, and variability within the population or subpopulation. Sampling methods. Sampling methods help us identify the target population as precisely as possible and in a way that makes sense in terms of the purpose of the study. They also help the researcher put together a list of the target population from which the sample will be selected. It also assists the researcher in selecting the sample and deciding on a sampling technique, as well as helps the researcher make an interpretation about the population. The main types of sampling methods: there are probability samples and non-probability samples. Probability samples are when each population element has a known chance of being chosen for the sample, voluntary or convenience. Non-probability samples are the researcher does not know the probability that each population element will be chosen, and the researcher cannot be sure that each population element has a non-zero chance of being chosen. Examples of those are simplified random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, multi-stage sampling, or systematic random sampling. Research procedure and research instruments. How to choose the right measurement instrument. Measurement instruments refer to the various methods through which a researcher can obtain data from the subject or subjects of their research. There are two major sources of data that needs to be collected. One is primary data, and this is data that the researcher obtains through the data collection process, such as through questionnaires, personal interviews, or observations. Secondary data is data that is already published or already out there for the public. Sources, for example, are journals, textbooks, newspapers, magazines, flyers, bulletins, periodicals, annual reports. Some of the data that needs to be collected is demographic information, such as their age, sex, gender, educational background, ethnicity, religion, scores, events, or any other type of data that is necessary for the study. Classification of research-based data collection instruments. There's applied, which are questionnaires, interviews, or observations; surveys, which are questionnaires, focus group discussions, interviews, and observations. Case studies involve questionnaires, interviews, focus group discussions, and observations. Ethnographic correlational research are observation, questionnaires, focus group discussions, and interviews. Historical observations are focus group discussions and interviews. Evaluation, focus group discussion, interview, and observation. Pure science, experiment and observations. Action, questionnaires and interviews. Longitudinal, questionnaires, observations, focus group discussions, interviews, and experiments in the case of pure science research. And exploratory data collection instrument, which is questionnaires, observations, and interviews. Outlining research procedures. There are 7 steps in the research process. Step 1, define the problem. Step 2, review the literature. Step 3, formulate a hypothesis. Step 4, develop the research design. Step 5, carry out the research process. Step 6, analyze the data. And Step 7, prepare the research report. The introduction section of the research study should explain the issue the researcher is examining and why it is significant. It must also include the background or review the related literature. The rationale should be included, which describes the types of questions the researcher is examining and an exploration of the claims. Some questions the researcher must ask themselves when deciding on a method. How would you collect the data and why? What would the stimuli look like and why? How are you going to present the stimuli? And what is the participant in the experiment going to do? After that has been collected, we will analyze the data, and the researcher must ask questions such as, how will I analyze the results? What kind of results would confirm my hypothesis? And what kind of results would disconfirm my hypothesis? The results or conclusions section should include why someone should care about this research. If you were applying for the money to do this, why would someone fund you? And if the researcher wanted to publish his results, why would they be interesting?